Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about secondary worlds, because as part of this sort of quest to define fantasy in the fantasy terms and how we think about it, secondary worlds are one of the key considerations. And of course, the term itself was coined by Tolkien in his essay and lecture on fairy stories. And one of the interesting things is with a secondary world, it seems at its core very easy to understand. And Tolkien's conception of it, which I'll go through in a second, is pretty straightforward. But the problem is with any of these definitional aspects, and what I keep coming back to is it's not about saying this is that it's how we conceive of it, where we're drawing the lines, how we conceptualize the elements. That is the interesting thing, because again, with portals, saying that's a portal and that's not a portal, people do this instinctively, but it's not really about whether or not it is or is not a portal, or is not a secondary world. It's where we're drawing the line to put it in that category. That is the actual interesting thing. Well, at least for me. And so secondary worlds, because they are so key to elements of, say, epic fantasy and high fantasy, and even just calling it a secondary world fantasy, all of these things, an element of that has to be how we're thinking of, how we're conceptualizing what a secondary world is. So again, following the format of the previous one, I'm going to go through like PowerPoint slideshow of some of these things and see where we end up. So as you can see here, I've put up the short snippet of a quotation from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And I would strongly recommend, Philip Chase has a discussion about Tolkien's essay, and Philip and I actually discussed it on this channel as well, some of the different elements about what Tolkien was getting at. But one of the things that we didn't really dig down into was Tolkien's definition of a secondary world. And his definition is an internally consistent, fictional fantasy world or setting that is different from the real primary world. And again, on the surface of it, when you look at this, this is a nice, easy, straightforward definition for what a secondary world is, until you start digging into the edges of it, where you're trying to define these different elements, where you're trying to find the limits of what this definition stretches toward, or what it contains. So for instance, let's take that first sort of clause that I've underlined, internally consistent. What Tolkien was getting at here is a concept of sub-creation, the idea of creating a almost wholly new fictional setting that abides by its own rules, that is its own thing, that it makes sense onto itself, not only through reference to or extension of an existing world. So internally consistent, it sets up rules and it follows those rules at its most standard sort of definition. But when we consider something like the creation of fairy realms, and fairy, depending on the author, fairy can be a strange conglomeration of all of these weird and wonderful lands that have wildly incoherent or nonsensical rules. And what Tolkien is getting at is they can have wildly inconsistent rules as long as it's consistent for the rules of fairy. So for instance, in a lot of these fairy stories, the idea of not aging and being immortal in the world, except we have people die in these fairy realms. So how can it be both? And it's, well, not aging is different to being absolutely immortal. Eternal youth just means that you don't age, not that you can't ever die. But when we think of some of the fairy realms in which gravity functions in a certain way, And then in some parts of that realm, gravity does not function in that way because it's a magical realm and almost anything goes. That's consistent with the rule that the realm itself is magical and does not conform to a simple norm about how gravity is meant to function the same way in all different places. So it's actually consistent in its inconsistency. So it's not necessarily that the realm must have rules that apply across the whole of the realm. It's that the rules established take into account that this is how this world functions. And if one of those rules is that it is chaotic, that it has strange rules, then as long as that carries on, it's internally consistent. So it's not about the external application of rules, it's about an internal consistency. The second part is obviously that it is fictional, that it cannot be real. And this gets us into a bit of a quandary, and it's something that's going to come up in some of the examples I talk about. All fiction is set in a fictional world. Even if a text is set in modern day London or modern day New York, it is a fictional version of that city. So Tolkien was kind of emphasizing completely fictional, that it is not New York, that it is not London. But that line isn't clear in what Tolkien is talking about because it wasn't part of what he was conceiving of. He was conceiving of something different. So his definition, how he was describing it, wasn't taking account of niche cases or thinking about literature as a whole. It was more focused on what he was trying to do with this and to signal that it's not meant to be considered real. We aren't meant to consider Middle Earth as a real place that we physically from this world can get on a plane and go and visit, that it was a fictional construct. It's not meant to be considered real. But at the same time, the concept of fictionality applies to any rendered world in fiction, because while aspects of it may be mimicking the real, they are never truly real. And again, there are shades of gray here with it, because we can get some fiction that is incredibly mimetic, that is very close to the real, that is trying to make it seem that this is our world, that we can get in a car and we can drive to the setting of that particular scene. But on the other hand, that scene is going to be in a fictional construct. So again, shades of gray, gray lines. It's in the center of the definition, very easy to see what is going on. As soon as you get to the edges of the definition, that's where things break down. And it's not, again, about saying, oh, well, this is definitely that, and that is definitely this. Here is a clear line. Those clear lines that we draw are going to be, A, have a certain thickness that's going to cover some text, but also B, personally drawn, that where we draw the line is not necessarily the same as where someone else does. And then we get on to the last sort of part of Tolkien's definition that I think is important, which is that this world or setting, and he says fantasy world or setting, but that's because he's talking about fantasy, but a world or setting that is different from the real or primary world. So our world is what Tolkien is referring to in terms of the real world, the primary world. And therefore, that's why these are secondary worlds. These are not the real or primary world. And he says that the secondary world has to be different. But how different is different? At what point does that become different enough? And again, that's a dividing line. So as a very quick example of this, if an author writes a story about a group of Templar knights who are going on a quest to find the Grail, and they leave from Lyon in France, and they travel across to the Middle East, they go on a quest, they visit towns and cities, they go out into the wilderness, they fight battles, and they find the Grail. That is clearly fictional because the Templars never found the Grail. But also the author has made it up, but based it in our world. And you go, right, so this could be, it's fiction, it could be alternate history or historical fiction, just depending on different categories. But if we went through and we changed the names of all of the cities, that's it. All we changed were the names from Lyon to Barzum, from Paris to Malaz City. And instead of going to the Middle East, they go to Roshar. And all we've done is we have changed the names, just those tags. The narrative events from the historical fiction remain the same. The dialogue remains the same. The characters remain the same. Does that suddenly change the historical fiction into something different? So before answering that question, before discussing it, I think we'll go through some of these examples of different ways of conceptualizing secondary worlds. And again, very similar fashion to how I discussed portals. But before answering that question about the historical fiction, want to have a look at some of these examples. Because in exploring the examples, we can talk about maybe what it is that we actually mean by secondary worlds. And one of the very first things is looking at these diegetic elements, these how it is described, what it looks like, how the characters interact with it, how the characters perceive it, all of these different elements that are within the text, looking at it from the specifics of what is in the text. And the first example is Tolkien's Middle-earth. And I've just used the image of the Argonath again, because, you know, it's recognizable. But Tolkien's Middle-earth, it seems like a good place to start. That's what we're starting with, Tolkien's definition. And in Middle-earth, we have a landmass that doesn't really match our Earth. You can take elements of it and turn it around and twist it around, try and go, oh, that corresponds to. But really, Middle-earth doesn't match our Earth. It is a secondary world. It is a different place. There are elves and orcs and dwarves and trolls, creatures and races and species that do not exist in our reality. There are dragons. So in a lot of respects, it is different. It is different to our primary world. It is fictional. It's not meant to be read as real. We aren't meant to believe that this actually happened. It is a fictional construct. And is it internally consistent? Tolkien spent a long time trying to iron out some of the inconsistencies that appear, because with any subcreation, with any creation of a secondary world, no one author or even team of authors can fully conceive of all of the different aspects of it, because like our brains just aren't big enough and we can't consider all the different ramifications. And even then, our world is inconsistent in a lot of ways. But in terms of the fundamentals, yes, Tolkien's world is internally consistent. It's self-referential. So we can see that Tolkien's Middle-earth fits the definition that Tolkien was talking about. Who would have seen that coming? That someone who's designed something designs a definition that actually encapsulates what they're talking about. So it's clear that Tolkien's Middle-earth is a concept of a secondary world. But in it, we do have references to our world, the fact that we do humans don't see hobbits anymore. They are harder to spot now. In which case, there's a slight overlap here, because the idea that humans today, or humans in Tolkien's time, may have come across a hobbit, or hobbits were still around, is suggesting that Middle-earth is not as different to our world as it initially appears, that there is connection between the two. But that's clearly not what Tolkien means, because the land masses don't line up. The geography doesn't line up. The world itself doesn't function the way that our world does. So in a sense, he's created almost an overlay, a mythic version. And when we think of Arthurian legend, where various people go to Avalon, the Isle of Mists, and that is you head out and then suddenly this place appears, but it doesn't always appear. It's not always in the same place, that there's something magical about where it is. So it's not necessarily in our world. It's almost like traveling through the mists is a way to access it. So while it is connected, it is separate and the connection is tenuous. What about Raymond D. Feist's Midkemia that we find in Magician? And of course, Kelly Wan, which is also explored in Feist and Wirtz's Empire trilogy. And this seems very much in the vein of Tolkien's definition. Midkemia, while there are elements drawn from medieval Europe, from a slightly Orientalist perspective of Egypt and parts of Africa for Kesh. And while there are aspects from Greco-Roman history that we find in the Kingdom of the Isles and the various islands and nations around that sort of part of the world, Midkemia is not meant to be read as Earth. It is not meant to be read as our world. It is drawing inspiration from these for a fictional construct, and it is internally consistent for the most part. There are always difficulties when you start following down the sort of the rabbit hole of aspects of a world to say, how does this work? And then trying to see that it goes so far and then the logic breaks down. So when we think of Midkemia ending up as part of a greater cosmology and being linked to all of these worlds and the Valharu and all of these sorts of different aspects, some of the generation makes sense at the time, but when you start teasing out the narrative logic, it falls down a little bit, especially when aspects of time travel through the mind are done. It's interesting, but it is divorced from our reality. It is different from the primary world. It is a fictional setting, and it is internally consistent. So this falls within Tolkien's definition of a secondary world. And as it is a very extensive series, the world gets more and more developed over time, and in something of a almost reusable setting, which is something I'll talk about in a different video. But we can clearly identify it as a secondary world, that it isn't meant to be considered Earth or a version of Earth. So what about Barzum in John Carter of Mars? And this is where we get into this tricky aspect, because Barzum, Mars, is not Earth. It is a fictional setting. Barzum is not our Mars. It is a fictional version of Mars. So it's not our primary world. It's not Earth. It's different to our primary world. It's set on a different planet. Is it a fantasy secondary world? And when we think about this, this is where the difference between, because obviously what we're talking about here is the story world as it's created and perceived by the characters within it. They see it as the normal reality. When we bring in portal fantasies and planetary romances and science fiction, we run into this issue with planets as potential secondary worlds. And the reason I say it's an issue, in John Carter of Mars, Carter goes from Earth, the primary world, or at least a fictional rendition of the primary world, to a strange world, a new world, and it is called Barzum by the inhabitants. It's not called Mars. So even the tag used to define and describe the world by the inhabitants is setting it apart from our human understanding of Mars. And that is or is not enough to separate it from Mars as part of our constructed primary world. Because when Tolkien is talking about the primary world, are we talking about solely about Earth? Or are we talking about our universe, our understanding of the planets in our solar system, our understanding of the planets in our galaxy? That it's not just about the primary world Earth, but our reality. And that extends the definition of secondary worlds outwards and causes a wrinkle, causes a complication, because Barzum, from the perception of the inhabitants, is not Mars. It is not our Mars. It is very, very different. Different technology, different races, different species, different animals, different societies. It does not match with any aspect of our reality or even what we know about Mars. But a further complication of this is how much of that is based on an understanding of what Mars was at the time that Burroughs was writing, and how much is it different now because we have a different understanding of Mars. And is that an excuse? Is the time period and authorial intent something that defines whether or not it's a secondary world? Because, you know, some people hold very strongly to death of the author, that authorial intent should not be considered. Other people view death of the author in kind of the way that it was intended, that authorial intent is something to be considered, but it doesn't override all else. And then other people go, no, authorial intent is incredibly important and we should place it in a status sort of primacy. So what about Barzum then? Is it a secondary world? The characters perceive it as their world. Carter interacts with it as their world. He interacts with it in a way that is not how he would interact with Earth. And here we have, unfortunately, it's not the best picture in the world, but I just quite like this. To extend this sort of problematic nature of planets. Here we have, on the face of it, you know, people dressed in togas of a kind. But it's clearly Kirk and Spock and Uhura on an alien planet. Well, an alien setting. I can't remember if this is actually on a planet or a ship, but from the sort of perception of it, we would sort of go, oh, this is kind of fantasy. They're wearing ancient Grecian-esque or Roman. It's very hard to describe those outfits. They really are quite special. But how they perceive and interact with this, they view this solely as an alien culture. They aren't viewing it as a recreation of Earth. They aren't viewing it as an ancient sort of mythic culture. This is very much a contemporary culture of the inhabitants of the story world that has chosen to dress and act this way and chosen to recreate these things. So the character interaction with it is very much placed in humanity's far future. So yes, it's fictional. Yes, it's internally consistent, but it is meant to be read as an extension of our world, of the primary world, through our future and our galaxy, our universe. So does it fall into Tolkien's concept of the secondary world? And this is why solely picking up on the narrative elements, just looking at the narrative elements and how characters interact with it or how it's described, is sometimes not particularly satisfying, because authorial intent and reader perception are important aspects in trying to understand whether or not something is a secondary world or what even a secondary world is, but also its narrative function. Because again, like portals, we can talk about what function does a secondary world have for the narrative. So I'm going to use the same examples again because I think they are slightly revelatory about the different aspects that we're talking about. So the narrative function of the secondary world for Tolkien, when we think of Middle-earth, this grand mythic, but never existed, was never to be read as if it existed. It was aspirational. It was an investigation of these different things. He wasn't ever writing, this is the history, the mythic history of England. That was something I think it was one of his biographers actually said at a later date, that that was his intention. But Tolkien was creating an entire fictional reality where these grand epic stories played out in a way that was not bound by the rules of our reality. So it wasn't bound by technology from our world. It wasn't bound by the magic of our world. He could go grander. He could go in different directions. He could change things. That it wasn't meant to be seen as an exploration of any one culture. It was a way of creating a grand mythic narrative that transcended the limitations that earthbound histories and cultures had. It was meant to be read as entirely fictional. So it was a way of exploring different stories and different quests to explore the strength of the individual, the courage of the individual, the fact that industrialization was bad and the devastating effect that industrialization could have without it being a polemic or a screed or a dry academic essay going, look at all of these new factories poisoning our rivers, because no one reads that. But when you see it in terms of a story, you can reach a greater audience and they can experience the effects of it to understand that that is an aspect that he was talking about, but to understand it on a more visceral level, because reading fiction requires immersion, and creating an immersive reality where some of these things play out as part of what is going on, not as the sole focus, allowed Tolkien to explore things that maybe were not necessarily the things that he wanted to explore in an essay. And also the active imagination, the inspiration, all of those different aspects of bringing us through reading into consideration of grand, sweeping epics, of the power of story to move us, to generate emotion. That's the function of this secondary world, divorcing it from our reality. So we aren't thinking about it in terms of, oh, these are Vikings. I know about Vikings. I will apply what I know about Vikings to this, because Norse raiders don't appear in Middle-earth. Looking at the hobbits and going, oh, they are representative of Little England and of a rural idyll in England, basically at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. That wasn't what Tolkien intended. He drew from that, but it wasn't to say this is Little England. It was to say this is the Shire. And yes, he drew inspiration from his summers in certain parts of England. He drew inspiration for other more disturbing aspects from his experience of the war. He drew experiences from the real, but created a fiction, a fictive reality through which to create a composite of all of these different experiences and weave it into something that was internally consistent and not dependent on the real, not dependent on the primary world, that was self-referential rather than defining or gaining its definition from contrast to our world. So then when we consider Magician and Midkemia and Kelly Wan, we can see much the same impulse in that of, yes, there are elements drawn from this world, but it is the creation of a fictive reality as a place to explore them, as a place to play with them, that some of the reference are there to ease with reader understanding, but it is to divorce it from our world. If something resembles part of Earth history, that may have been an inspiration for Feist, But it is not to say, oh, if you know Earth history and you know this thing, that is what I am doing. It is not dependent on the primary world. It's not dependent on the real world. It is internally consistent. And then this gets slightly problematized with John Carter of Mars and Barzum, because here, like a lot of portals, and not necessarily portal fantasies, John Carter of Mars is a planetary romance, but we have a transition from Earth to Mars, or a conception of Mars. And because of building in that, yes, here is the real world in the story world, in the diegesis, there is a contrast being made between Earth history and our history and what happens on Barzum. That the adventures on Barzum are an adventure. They are meant to be this internally consistent, different world that is separate from ours. But the juxtaposition of the two leads to a direct contrast. And that's different to what Tolkien was doing. That's not the same as what Tolkien was doing. We very deliberately have Earth and Mars being compared and contrasted in John Carter. So it's in its conception, Barzum itself, if we removed those elements of the primary world and only had the adventures of John Carter on Barzum, that would be closer in conception to Middle Earth or Midkemia, because it's an internally consistent world. It has its own history. Its history is divorced from our history. It's not our world. It's a different world. It's entirely fictional, and it's intended to be read as fictional. All of those different elements of Tolkien's definition apply to Barzum, to the Mars of John Carter. But because it is placed in conversation with, in direct conversation with, direct dialogue with what is happening on Earth, a period of Earth history, the elements of John Carter's education and experience that lead to his, what he does and how he understands the conflicts on Barzum, all of those things are directly drawing that secondary world closer to a consideration of our reality. And that can lead to the reading of certain elements as analogues for, or symbols of, or explorations of aspects of our history. It's inviting that. And that is part of the narrative function. But when we get to the Star Trek example, it follows on from this, because this is meant to be our far future. It's meant to show in sharp relief what we do in our world, or the world of Gene Roddenberry, our primary world. What we do is shown in sharp relief against what is happening in the secondary world, in this Star Trek universe. It is meant to be our world. It is meant to be real, but it is so far in the future that it is not bound by some of the things from our history. So the same thing that Tolkien was talking about, the use of these entirely created fictive worlds to get away from the real so that you weren't bound by the rules of the real. Roddenberry here has used the far future as a way to do the same thing. So instead of it being conceptually a different world, it's using a temporal distance to move from the primary and the real to create a secondary, consistent, internally consistent reality that is fictional, and has used time as the distance between the real and the secondary world. So you can see, trying to do different things with it, why they are using these different techniques, is ultimately to create a very similar effect in the reader and in the perception of the narrative. Which brings us on to talking about effect. So when we consider it in terms of the perception of the genre, quite often we think of science fiction as radically different to fantasy. So obviously this is taking us on now into more of a discussion of the effect. And we want to talk about the effect that the author was trying to achieve, potentially, because obviously can't ask all of these authors, and I haven't had the opportunity to ask the ones who are still alive. But the effect that was trying to be achieved, or the effect that is achieved, what that does in terms of how the reader perceives things, which is distinct to how the characters perceive things. And so perception of genre is a big thing. When we look at something in terms of science fiction, we are assuming quite often, even if it is meant to be a science fictional construct that is different to the primary, that it is in some way, because it is science fiction, science is there, that it is in some way linked to rationality, whereas fantasy quite often is described as irrational because magic is irrational, which obviously hard magic as a way of approaching magic as a sort of form of science or an integral part of the story world is pushing back against that. And that again brings in Clarke's law. But when we think of how we approach text, looking at something as going to an alien world, so in Star Trek, or even in John Carter, that going to an alien world, we tend to view with a different set of expectations than we do about characters in a fantasy world. That if you think in Renaissance fairs, some people cosplay as people from Star Trek going to a Renaissance fair, as if they're going to an alien planet. Whereas other people go to Renaissance fairs as we're going to experience a Disneyfied version of the past where everyone's eating turkey legs. Set that aside for a moment. But you can see the intentionality of that interaction actually suggests something different. One from a rational scientific perspective, oh, we're going to go and study almost anthropologically these people as it's a strange planet and they're going to walk around and record them as alien, as different, as other. Whereas in the other form, it's no, this is part of us. This is part of our history. This is part of where we come from and is deeply connected to us. So the science fictional approach sometimes emphasizes that difference. And by emphasizing the difference, actually gets to a compare and contrast to then ultimately highlight points of comparison and points of similarity, but to show things in sharp relief. Whereas we think sometimes of fantasy more as immersive, that it is not trying to be a direct contrast. And of course, this is a massive generalization and sweeping statement because a lot of fantasy is very much looking at and is inspired by or is a rendition of aspects of our past, of our cultural history, of different historical events, rendered into a fantasy form to allow exploration without a preconceived bias or notion coming into play. So that is one of the reasons why secondary worlds, be they science fictional or be they fantasy, are so useful. It removes the implicit bias that we may have, an unconscious bias that we may have based on our preconceived notions about something, and places them in a different context so that those biases and reactions are removed and we consider the facts of what is happening directly, instead of, oh, but I understand something of this history and that's misrepresenting that, or they haven't taken that into account, and arguing with the text instead of trying to follow what the text is saying. So secondary worlds, be they temporally removed the way that Gene Roddenberry did with Star Trek, or metaphysically removed the way that Tolkien did with The Lord of the Rings, is a way of addressing core aspects of humanity sometimes by removing them from direct consideration and allowing an exploration of the human condition removed from historical context and a reality perception bias. And that is actually an important point of connection between, regardless of how we define secondary worlds and science fiction and fantasy, it's an important aspect of why these strange settings are used, even if the genre is tweaking an aspect of that. And so that gets into playing with our reader expectations. But one of the reasons why Tolkien talked about suspension of disbelief and the need for it to be internally consistent, if the world is entirely whimsical and doesn't have any internal consistency, there is a danger that people view it as mere frippery, as whimsical, as a silly story that you can enjoy the story, but it's not persuasive, it's not engaging, and it's not immersive, that you're not buying into immersing yourself in this reality to try to find where it takes you. You're being held back from it because the world is silly and it doesn't make sense. But of course, there are exceptions to that. Look at the absurdity of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. And yet, through that absurdity, Pratchett was drawing very direct social commentary aimed at our world, aimed at the different notions that we have about how stories should function versus how reality should function, the impact of technology, social change, the perception of and promulgation of racial and cultural stereotypes and bias, and how that is combated in Discworld. And Discworld is ludicrous and absurd and quite often inconsistent. And yet, the brilliance of that is where Tolkien was creating an immersive reality that was internally consistent and divorced from our world, and Roddenberry was using temporal relocation to the far future. Pratchett uses elements of both, but also absurdity as a way to, in some ways, separate it as a direct commentary on these things, to allow us to engage in a direct commentary and to absorb some of the lessons that he could explore almost with a softer filter on them. Because someone can say racism is bad, and you go, yeah, racism is bad. But when we see how the dwarves are treated in Discworld and the strive for equality in Discworld, or when we talk about corporate culture and jobs and we see how that is treated, or even his commentary on economics and Vimes's whole spiel about the cheap boots run out quicker, so you end up spending more on replacing them. Whereas if you can buy expensive boots, they last longer. So if you have money, you actually end up saving money, even though the initial item is more expensive. Direct commentary on consumerist capitalism. And it's hidden in an absurd, silly, ridiculous, brilliant fantasy series. But it isn't meant to be read as a consistent secondary world. It is meant to be read as absurd. And yet he builds it out over time so that even the inconsistencies become consistent inconsistencies. Discworld is one of those ones that always throws things completely out of the way, because Sir Terry Pratchett was just such a fantastic author. But we can see elements of how our suspension of disbelief, how we approach texts, the perception of the genre, our expectation about what the text is going to do. All of these things are played with by authors who create these settings. And whether the setting is meant to be read as part of our world, or meant to be read as separate from our world, or meant to be read as far future, all of these are different techniques to approach the same sort of thing. Now we get on to the let's play the game. Are these secondary worlds? And let's have a think about the land. Obviously ties into like a response to Tolkien creating a psychological secondary world that the central character Thomas Covenant goes to. But initially he is in our world. He wakes up in the land, and initially it is framed kind of like a portal quest, or portal fantasy, bringing in a direct contrast to our world, and the disbelief that a we would have if we arrived in a fantasy world. Thomas Covenant, the unbeliever, he doesn't believe in the land because it is too strange, too unreal. And for everyone who has a problem with how Covenant, the book, starts, part of this is if you were transported into this world with all of the conditions and psychology that he has, then you don't really believe it. It's a dream world. And then trying to deal with the ramifications when the dream is actually revealed to be real, what do we then do? And there's a psychological realism to a lot of what Donaldson is exploring in this world, where the internal mind and the internal conflicts that we all have are literalized and formalized in this secondary world. So it is a way to explore some of the darkest aspects of humanity through a metaphorical or allegorical lens by literalizing them, by having them turned into these external adventures and these external conflicts. So it's a fascinating series for that regard. And the land does function as a consistent, internally consistent, fictional reality that is explicitly divorced from ours, from the real. It fits that Tolkien-esque definition or Tolkienian definition of a secondary world. But again, labeling it as a secondary world is not the issue. It's why is it a secondary world? What is it doing? That is far more important than sticking the label on that it's a secondary world. The Wheel of Time, Randland in the Wheel of Time, because we don't really explore the other continents that much. There's little hints of other lands, but it is very Eurocentric. It is based on a sort of not quite Disneyfied version of medieval or Renaissance history. And of course, Jordan complicates it as the series goes on because there's a temporal aspect about far future and the whole rise and fall of civilizations, and it ties into a concept of dark ages and the great and glorious past being so much more civilized to a more barbaric future before we rise again. All of these things play into it, but Randland and the world of the Wheel of Time is, of course, divorced from the real. Although a lot of it, you can see points of connection to Arthurian legend, that Arthur existed in this world, that it's a version of Arthur. And then when we get into concepts of the different parallel realities, we see potentially this is a parallel Earth, that this is a variant of Earth where all of these things have happened. But we have temporal and metaphysical or fictional separation. So again, it's a way of setting some of these things into a different world to get away from the historical realities of Earth and the conflicts that have shaped our history, that still have repercussions and ramifications for today in how we perceive certain conflicts. This one you might not recognize. It looks like a medieval setting. It doesn't look any different. This is actually from Stargate SG1. And if we place the figures of the Stargate team in it with their uniforms and their guns, you would clearly see it as science fictional. But this actually goes to something that I've talked about before, which is an anecdote by Orson Scott Card about writing a science fiction story that was rejected by a science fiction publishing magazine because it was a fantasy story. And it was because he hadn't outlined or detailed in the short story that the main character had arrived on this planet via spaceship, that the powers being used were science fictional powers of psionics, not magic, and that these aliens, although humanoid and dressed in medieval garb, were actually aliens on a planet inspired by that analog. And here we can see that in effect. If you just saw that image, you would think, oh, this is historical fiction. This is fantasy world because of the garb and how people are walking around. But as soon as you put in the Stargate team, it becomes science fictional. And that shows you, I think, the difficulty of secondary worlds are a fantasy concern, whereas alien planets are something entirely different. There's a lot of overlap between these concepts, and most of it has to do, the distinctions, most of it has to do with how we perceive the genre, how we are interacting with it, how we are approaching what the story is, and how then the writers are playing with that expectation. And here, Avengers Endgame. Now, the reason I want to bring this up, because I want to talk about this idea of it being different from our reality. How different is different? Avengers is set on Earth predominantly. It's a story about Earth and Earthlings and humans. It is set ostensibly in our universe with planets and technology. So we could say it's science fiction. But it also has magic. It also has fictional countries that don't exist in our world, have never existed in our world, and never will exist in our world. It has technology that does not exist in our time. It has historical events that don't exist in our world. It is different to the primary world. In a lot of respects, it's similar. We're meant to recognize it as Earth. A lot of the mundane technology is meant to be similar to the contemporaneous period in which it was filmed, created, and shown initially. But how different does a world have to be, does a story world have to be, in order for it to be considered different to the primary world? Is it just the intention that this is meant to be a variant of Earth? Is that enough to say that it is similar enough to Earth to not be considered a secondary world? Or do we say, oh, well, magic exists as a real thing, and mystical cities exist even though they don't in our world, and countries and these things, all radically different? Is this alternate history? Is that what this is? Is this a science fictional alternate history? Is it science fiction because of the technology? Is it fantasy because of the magic? And you can see, trying to say it is one thing is why I keep saying that the definition is not the end goal. It's how the definition helps shape what we think about it. Because clearly there are science fictional elements, there are fantasy elements, there are real world elements, but there are also non-mimetic elements. So when we think of the problems that Ant-Man has with divorce and his daughter and all of those things in a heist movie, that seems very, very mimetic. But of course, the technology involved in all of that is weird. It doesn't exist, won't exist, cannot exist, doesn't make any sense, is irrational, and is indistinguishable basically from magic, because it's even inconsistent with how it works. I can get onto a different rant about Ant-Man in a different video. But there are elements of science fictionality. There are elements of fantastic realities. So what is it? And trying to pin it down to a definition is missing the point. It's looking at how these elements teach us how to read or inform how we approach the text, what it is that we're meant to believe in, what it is that we're meant to suspend our disbelief for. Because Valkyrie riding a Pegasus, really? In a world where we're meant to believe in physics and spaceships, the aerodynamics of a Pegasus do not make sense. But Valkyrie is riding a Pegasus, a giant floating creature that swims through space, that we can believe in, but it can also just swim through Earth's atmosphere. But that's a gravity well that has air resistance, and you would need aerodynamics. That's slightly different. Ships that function perfectly in space as if they were planes, and yet don't take into account how momentum works in zero gravity. Sound operating in space. How many of these differences from our reality are enough for us to say that the world of Avengers is a secondary world and not meant to be the real world. And that's what I was getting to with that question at the beginning about the Templars, which we'll return to in a minute. But I think we can see this again in another example, which is the Dresden Files. It's set in Chicago. Chicago, famously at the very beginning, which Jim Butcher didn't know a lot about. Subsequently, he may have spent a lot of time in Chicago, but Chicago was an entirely fictional setting for him because he wasn't that familiar with it. And yet, it's meant to be a variant, a version, a representation of Chicago from our world. And yet magic exists. We have this split between a mundane reality and a fantastical reality. And Dresden is living in both worlds. And the more he is in one world, the more that causes problems for him in the other world. And, you know, we can read a lot into that sort of binary and that polarity of applying it metaphorically to aspects of our lives. The more that we're involved with one thing, the less that can cause problems with others. Work-life balance, we can see that analog being played out. But how many differences from our world do there need to be for the Chicago of the Dresden Files to be considered a secondary world? And how much of it are we meant to say, no, it's just the same as our world? But with magic. And this will come down to reader expectation and reader decision and how we are processing not only what a secondary world is, but why a secondary world is important, what the function of the secondary world is. And again, applying the label and going, this is a secondary world, is not the point, because it's all about the reason for it and these gray areas and looking at the authorial intent, the effect on the reader, the perception of the world and what it is the text is exploring. And labels like secondary world are just that. It's a label. It's a handy catch-all. It's a handy tag to put on something as a shorthand for complex discussions, as long as everyone is aware of what the complex discussion is. But if you aren't aware of the complexity of the considerations of secondary worlds, then the term secondary world is actually meaningless because you're applying a tag without understanding the content that the tag is encapsulating. So the last thing that I want to discuss is that initial question about how much can we change about a historical narrative, historical fiction. How much can we change before it becomes fantasy? Because that is not an easy dividing line. If we change just the names of the things, that signals a complete change of perception, because we are not meant now to see it as historical. We are meant to see it as fantastical. But is that enough to make it a secondary world? And some people will say yes. So even if ignoring that example, if we take something from history, an exact thing from history, and we write it out as it actually occurred, and we change just the names without changing anything else, just go through and do a find and replace on all of the names, that is enough to separate it from our reality, because the author is clearly intending that this not be seen as a recreation of the bit from history, but to look at what that story is actually telling us, what that story is actually exploring. Because if we write a story about the Templars on the Crusades, that brings in a lot of cultural baggage about the Crusades, about the treatment of people by the Templars. It brings in a complex reality that has repercussions in our world, in our history, and in our perception of those acts. But if we change it, we're now looking at something that is slightly removed from that, and we start judging not just on what we know from history, not just where we align or are aware of that history because of culture or religion or where we were born or what place that we grew up in and we live in. Instead of bringing those things to bear, we're actually focused on what is being discussed in the story. And sometimes that allows us to focus on individual actions. Sometimes it allows us a deeper investigation into what characters are doing and what that says about the human condition, or what that says about individual character, what that says about moral consequence and moral concepts and these issues. Or it can be about how grand narratives are spun and myths created out of genuinely barbaric acts. And that's one of the reasons why we write historical fiction, that sometimes it's a glimpse beneath the true version of what happened that has now been mythologized over time. You look at films that are historical fiction, like Troy, which was ostensibly a glimpse behind the mythic nature of the Iliad and looking at the real events that actually occurred and giving us mundane explanations for supernatural events. The history of Alexander the Great, when you watch that film, Alexander, again, trying to fictionalize in a mimetic way what is happening instead of, say, David Gemmell's version of Alexander, which is in a fantasy world. And it's clearly based on Alexander's life, but is playing into these different aspects to look at different parts of Alexander's character divorced from the reality of what actually happened. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your continued support. Like, I really do appreciate anyone who gives me a little donation on the coffee link. It is fantastic, and thank you so much. But see you in the next one.